Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. This is game number 53 of the series where we're going through the book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. We're continuing to look at the games of Efim Bogoljubov. This time his opponent is Jacob Mieses. And this game is going to be another example of how Bogoljubov is able to attack on both the queen side and the king side at the same time, and the attacks seem to have little to do with each other, yet they work in harmony. Now Bogoljubov starts with d4, and we have f5 going into the Dutch defense, and g3. Now this was one of the main ways of playing against the Dutch defense, and it remains really quite fashionable. The idea is to try and apply a lot of pressure along this diagonal and therefore make it difficult for black to develop this bishop, especially because the f5 pawn blocks this bishop's development. Black continues with knight f6. We have bishop to g2, e6, knight f3, and now d5. And Reti is a bit critical of this move because d5 sort of shows black's intentions. It's clear that black is intending a stone wall setup. And Reti comments that a stone wall setup is only really effective if black is able to retain their dark square bishop, because otherwise there'll just be too many dark square weaknesses in black's position. And he says that perhaps d5 should have been delayed slightly until after white had played e3, blocking in their own dark square bishop, because now white will know not to play e3 until later on, because then they can potentially bring this bishop out and trade it off for this dark square bishop. Now here white castles. We see bishop to d6, c4, c6, knight c3, knight b to d7. Now Reti comments that if black captures on c4, white could play knight to d2, simply trying to capture back. However, Reti adds that even if black can take on c4 and hold on to this extra pawn, then to do so would be really quite dangerous, because it would make black's entire setup quite meaningless. White would have a lot of potential breakthroughs in the position, and black's pawn structure would be destroyed and really quite meaningless. Black's really tried to clamp down on these light squares, and as soon as they take it, then black's no longer doing that. Black will have a backwards pawn here. They'll have slightly less space. White will have a huge amount of control over the c5 and e5 squares, and potential weaknesses with e6, particularly the e5 square, because this pawn will be backwards. So even if black could win this pawn, to take the pawn is going to be a bad idea, because it just makes black's setup meaningless. White will just crush black after that. Now here white continues with queen to c2. We have knight to e4 and king h1. So white's already intending to use the g file for an attack. With queen f, that's the king. We have queen f6 and bishop f4, intending to trade bishops. Remember what we said when black first played d5? That Reti was critical of the move because it makes it clear that white wants to try and trade these two bishops. And now we see why, because white's able to trade the bishops because they haven't played e3. They knew not to play e3. And we also see the beauty of king h1 in that after black takes and g takes, white will have the open g file. And also g4 may be on the cards if black doesn't take, which would then still give them the open g file. Now here we have bishop takes f4, g takes f4, queen to h6, attacking the weak pawn, e3, defending the pawn, knight d to f6, knight e5, so now knight to d7, aiming to trade off the knight. We have rook to g1, trying to use the open file, knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes c3, and b takes c3. Now Reti comments that queen takes c3 is perhaps the more natural move, but b takes c3 was played instead. And the reason is Bogoljubov wants to try and break through with something like c takes d5 and then possibly pushing c4 afterwards. And he's also thinking about trying to use the b file for his rooks for potential queenside play. Now here Reti writes that black's position here, well, white's position, sorry, is clearly superior. White has a lot more space, and white's bishop is the better bishop. Black's bishop is just stuck on c8 with no real good squares to develop. And black has a lot of dark square weaknesses, and no dark square bishop to counteract those weaknesses. However, it's still very difficult to really see how white will be able to break through in a position. Yes, white is better, but converting that advantage is very difficult. However, we see Bogoljubov manages to come up with a nice little play. So we see bishop to d7, rook a to d1, b5. Now here, black is immediately trying to remove white's chances of breaking through on the queen side. And indeed, after c takes b5 or c takes d5, white will have a potentially worse position then, since everything would be quite quiet on the king side, and black would have been able to essentially stop any counterplay at all. And after these exchanges, this c3 pawn will become very weak and a point of attack for black. So actually, if white were to take, then white's position is perhaps a little bit worse, according to Reti. Now here we see queen to b2, castles, and queen to a3. So we see that Bogoljubov is slowly trying to improve his position slightly more, just to try and utilize the weak dark squares in black's position. However, Reti does comment that black can still quite easily defend against the white king, the white queen invading their position. White hasn't got a huge amount of activity. It's not going to be hard to defend against one piece, even if that one piece is the queen. Now here we see rook f to d8, and now we see c takes b5. And Reti comments that this looks bad because it creates the weakness on c3. However, here it works really quite nicely because of a combination which Bogoljubov has been able to think out in advance. See, c takes b5, and now queen to a6. And with this move, Bogoljubov is able to cement his queen on the queen side, but he's also attacking the king side. So immediately we see the threat of bishop takes d5. Because after takes, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, you'll see that the rook will be opened up to the king, so this g-pawn will be pinned, meaning that queen takes h6 is an option. So if I just waste a move, the threat is bishop takes d5, because after pawn takes d5, queen takes h6, because the pawn is pinned. So queen to a6 is a move on the queen side. It's clearly putting pressure on the queen side, but it's also attacking the king side. Now here we see queen to h5. Now Reti comments that queen h4 would have been met with rook takes d5, a nice beautiful sacrifice. Because after e takes d5, bishop takes d5 with check, and now the king has to move. So the king can move to f8 or to h8. So let's look at h8 first. King h8, we can then see something like bishop takes a8, and after rook takes a8, queen to b7, a double attack, rook to d8, and now e6. And at the very least you would win back some material, because the bishop's obviously pinned because of the threat of mate. However, queen takes f2 is also an option, but this is where Reti's variation ends, and it's quite clear that white is the one who's probably going to be holding the cards here. So we're looking at queen h4, rook takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes d5, king to f8. So we just looked at king to h8, the other move is king f8, and now rook to g5 is the winning move given by Reti. He says that other moves just don't quite work as well as this one. And the variation he gives is queen to h6 to try and trade off queens and to defend a bit more on the king side. e6, and now black is defenseless. If black were to take on e6, then bishop takes e6, and there's a lot of threats here now. So white is immediately threatening rook takes f5 check. If the king ever goes on to a dark square, there could be some potential discovered attacks against this queen as well. Black is quite defenseless against a lot of attacks here. And this is where Reti ends his variation. So that's what was planned after queen to h4. But we don't see queen to h4, we see queen to h5. And now we see bishop takes d5 anyway. So we see how every variation has a sacrifice on d5. It's really quite pretty. So Bogoljubov immediately breaks through in the centre, and white's queen, although on the queen side, still has a clear amount of pressure on the king side. E takes d5, rook takes g7 check. King takes g7, and now queen to f6 check. So king g8 is the only move. Rook to g1, and now here black plays queen to g4. So Reti comments that black seemed to be quite confident that his queen sacrifice would work. Because after all, after the exchange, which is what happens in the game, rook takes, pawn takes, black has 2 rooks and a bishop for the queen. I mean, 2 rooks versus a queen can be quite equal, one can be better than the other. But if you add a bishop in there as well, black is materially winning. However, Bogoljubov's plan here was to simply push his pawns with f5. His centre pawns are free, and these centre pawns are going to be what wins the game. And we see that black hasn't really got any defences against them. See, rook d to c8, e6 comes, bishop to c6, queen to f7 check, king h8, and f6. The pawns are slowly moving their way up the board, and they're becoming scarier and scarier. Rook to g8 is played. You see queen to c7, rook a to c8, defending the bishop and attacking the queen. Queen to e5. Now d4 check, but king g1, and now bishop to d5. So black is essentially almost trying to save himself. He's enticing white to take the bishop, because then after pawn takes c3, white's still winning. He's got 2 very strong pawns here, but black can try and argue that he has quite some very strong counterplay with his c pawn defended by the rook. However, Bogoljubov doesn't take the bishop. He plays f7 check first. And after king g7, now he plays queen takes d5. And here, with these 2 pawns this far up the board, black resigned, because the position is just lost. And so that's game number 53, another masterpiece of Bogoljubov. And unfortunately, Jacob Mieses seems to be on the receiving end of a lot of the masters we're looking at. But that still results in some very nice games. If you like this video, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time for game number 54, continuing with the Bogoljubov saga. Thank you for watching.